It was a cool Monday morning, and Officer Dan was already annoyed. His alarm had gone off late, and he had spilled some coffee on his shirt before even leaving the house. He didn't like starting the day this way. Driving through the quiet streets of his town, he sipped from a fresh cup and hoped the rest of the day would go better. Officer Dan was known in the station for being tough. He didn't talk much, and when he did, it often came with a sharp tone. He had been with the department for almost 10 years. To him, he knew the town like the back of his hand. But what others didn't say out loud was that Dan sometimes treated people differently, especially if they didn't look like him or if they were from the wrong part of town. As he passed the station, he noticed a black SUV parked out front. A man stood beside it, dressed in a neat dark suit. The man looked calm, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the building like he was waiting for someone. Dan didn't recognize him, and that was enough for suspicion to spark in his mind. He slowed his car and pulled up beside the SUV. He rolled down the window, narrowed his eyes, and called out, "Everything all right here?" The man looked over and smiled politely. "Yes, officer. Just waiting for someone." Dan didn't like the answer. Something about the man's confidence made him uneasy. Instead of driving off, he parked, stepped out of his cruiser, and approached the man slowly. "Do you have business here at the station?" Dan asked, his voice sharp. "I do," the man replied, still calm. "Well, this is a police zone. You can't just stand around outside." The man nodded. "I understand. I was told to wait here." Dan folded his arms. He didn't like being brushed off. In his mind, he thought, who is this guy to act like he belongs here? He took a step closer. "Listen," he said, voice rising slightly. "If you're not going to tell me who you're meeting or what you're doing here, I'll have to ask you to move along." The man looked at him, his smile fading just a little. "Trust me," he said calmly, "you'll know soon enough." That answer pushed Dan over the edge. Feeling disrespected and wanting to show who was in charge, he spat on the ground near the man's shoe. The act was quick and quiet, but full of disrespect. The man looked down at the spit, then back at Dan. His face didn't show anger. Instead, he gave a small nod and said, "You'll regret that." With those words, he turned and walked toward the station doors. Dan stood there for a moment, confused. He had expected the man to argue or maybe leave, but instead, he had walked in with purpose. Dan shook his head and muttered, "Whatever," before heading back to his cruiser. He had no idea what was about to happen. Inside the police station, the man in the suit walked through the front lobby calmly. He nodded politely at the front desk officer, who looked surprised but didn't say anything. The man moved with quiet confidence, like he had walked these halls before. He disappeared into a side hallway, leaving the officer at the desk scratching his head. Outside, Officer Dan sat in his patrol car, watching the front entrance. He couldn't stop thinking about the man's last words. "You'll regret that." Who did this guy think he was? Dan shook his head and turned the key in the ignition, pulling away from the station. His next stop was a routine patrol, and he didn't want to waste time thinking about some stranger. As he drove, Dan's mood was still sour. He kept replaying the moment in his head. The man had stayed so calm, even when Dan had been rude. Usually, people backed down when Dan raised his voice, but not this guy. Something about it made Dan uneasy, even though he would never admit it out loud. Meanwhile, back at the station, the building was starting to buzz with energy. Officers were finishing up their morning tasks when an announcement came over the speakers. "All staff, please report to the briefing room in 10 minutes for an important announcement." It wasn't unusual for meetings to happen, but the tone in the voice was different. People started whispering to each other, wondering what it could be about. New policies? A surprise inspection? Rumors started flying. Dan got the message over the radio while he was grabbing a quick bite at a corner store. He sighed and drove back to the station, still thinking about the man in the suit. He figured the meeting would be boring, like most others. When he arrived, the briefing room was nearly full. Officers stood around, chatting quietly. Dan found a spot near the back wall and crossed his arms. He didn't like these meetings much. Officer Dan stood frozen at the back of the room. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides. He didn't hear the clapping or the whispers around him. All he could hear were the words echoing in his mind, "Chief Darren Lewis." The same man he had spoken down to just hours ago. The same man he had tried to chase away. He felt like everyone could see right through him, though no one seemed to notice yet. Dan lowered his head slightly, hoping to blend into the crowd. He wished he had never gotten out of his car that morning. At the front of the room, Chief Lewis spoke into the microphone. His voice was calm and steady. "Thank you for the warm welcome. I know change can feel uncertain, but I didn't come here to point fingers or create fear. I came to build something better with all of you." His words were clear and strong, but they weren't angry. He didn't talk about power or control. Instead, he talked about teamwork, trust, and the need to serve the community with respect. Dan shifted uncomfortably in place. He felt each word more than he wanted to. Part of him hoped the new chief would call him out, maybe right then and there. Part of him hoped he wouldn't say anything at all. Then Chief Lewis said something that made the room quiet again. "I've already had the chance to meet a few of you this morning. Some introductions were more memorable than others." A few officers chuckled, thinking it was just a light joke, but Dan knew exactly who those words were meant for. Chief Lewis didn't look at him, not directly, but Dan could feel it. The air in the room felt heavier, like something important had just been said, even if no names were used. The meeting ended a few minutes later. Officers slowly began to leave the room, chatting about the new chief and wondering what changes would come next. Dan stayed behind for a moment, pretending to check his phone. Really, he just needed time to breathe. His heart was still racing. He felt embarrassed, unsure, and even a little angry, though he didn't know who he was mad at more, Chief Lewis or himself. As he left the room, he caught a glimpse of the chief talking with a few senior officers. Chief Lewis glanced his way for just a second. Not a glare, not a smirk, just a calm, quiet look. Dan turned and walked toward the hallway, his thoughts spinning. He had never felt this unsure of his place before. For the first time in years, Officer Dan didn't feel like he was in control. And deep down, he knew things at the station were about to change in a big way. The rest of the day felt long for Officer Dan. He tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the meeting. Every time he thought about Chief Lewis standing at the front of the room, he felt his stomach twist. It was like walking with a heavy backpack that he couldn't take off. Around the station, the mood was different. Officers talked quietly in corners, sharing thoughts about the new chief. Some were hopeful. Others were unsure. Change didn't come often in their department, and when it did, it made people nervous. Dan walked into the locker room and overheard two officers near the benches. "Seems like the new chief means business," one said. "Yeah." The other replied, "He doesn't look like someone you want to cross." Dan kept his head down and opened his locker, pretending not to hear. He wondered if anyone knew what had happened that morning. Had the chief told anyone? Did the captain know? The questions kept spinning in his head. Later that afternoon, Dan got called to a routine call downtown. It was nothing serious, just a shop owner reporting some noise from the alley behind their store. As he drove, he tried to shake off the feeling of tension. He told himself that one awkward moment shouldn't ruin everything. After checking the alley and finding nothing out of the ordinary, Dan got back into his car. Just as he started the engine, his radio crackled. "Officer Dan, please return to the station. Chief Lewis would like to speak with you." Dan froze for a second. His hand paused on the gearshift. The voice on the radio sounded calm, but the message hit him hard. "Copy that," he replied, trying to sound normal. The drive back felt slower than usual. Every turn, every red light gave him more time to worry. He didn't know what the chief was going to say. Would he be written up? Suspended? Worse. When Dan arrived, he walked through the hallway with a quiet step. The station felt more serious than before, even though everything looked the same. He reached the chief's office and stood outside for a moment. He took a deep breath, then knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," a voice said from inside. Dan stepped into the office. Chief Lewis sat behind the desk, a folder open in front of him. He looked up with the same calm face he had shown all day. "Have a seat, officer," the chief said. Dan sat down slowly, hands resting in his lap. He didn't speak. Chief Lewis closed the folder gently and leaned forward. "This morning was unfortunate," he began. Dan swallowed hard. He nodded once, but still didn't say anything. "But I didn't call you here to embarrass you," the chief continued. Dan looked up, surprised. Chief Lewis added, "I called you here because this department needs change, and change starts with facing the truth." Dan sat quietly, unsure of what was coming next. Officer Dan sat in the chair, trying to stay calm. His hands were still, but his thoughts were loud. He had expected anger or punishment. Instead, Chief Lewis spoke in a quiet and steady voice. "I've seen officers like you before," the chief said. "Hardworking, sharp, but sometimes too quick to judge." Dan looked down. He didn't argue. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew what the chief was saying was true. "You didn't know who I was this morning," the chief continued. "But it shouldn't have mattered. Respect isn't about rank or power. It's about how we treat people, every day." Dan nodded slowly. It wasn't easy to hear, but he didn't feel attacked. It felt more like someone telling him something he had ignored for a long time. "We can't fix a department by hiding our mistakes," Chief Lewis added. "We fix it by learning from them." For a moment, there was silence. Dan finally looked up and met the chief's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, voice low but honest. "I was wrong." The chief didn't smile, but his tone softened. "Thank you. That's a start." He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not going to suspend you, but I do expect better. Not just from you, but from everyone in this building. We will set a new standard here." Dan felt something shift inside him. It wasn't just guilt anymore. It was the beginning of understanding. Before Dan left the office, Chief Lewis said one more thing. "How we carry the badge matters. People are watching us, whether we know it or not. Your choices on the street reflect all of us." Dan nodded again. "Yes, sir." As he walked out of the office, Dan felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because he was given a second chance. Heavier because now he had to live up to it. He passed a few officers in the hallway who gave polite nods. None of them knew what had just happened, but Dan knew things were different now. He stepped outside into the afternoon sun. The air felt cooler than before. He stood for a moment, just breathing and thinking. He had always believed he was doing his job right. Follow orders, stay sharp, don't get soft. But now he was starting to see that being a good officer meant more than that. It meant listening. It meant showing respect, even when no one was watching, even when you thought you were the one in charge. Dan walked to this car with a new feeling. Not fear, not pride, but something in between. He wasn't sure what kind of officer he would become, but for the first time in a long while, he was ready to learn. And somewhere inside, he knew that Chief Lewis wasn't just there to lead the department. He was there to change it for the better. The next few days at the station felt different. There was no big announcement, no sudden change in rules, but something had clearly shifted. Officers were more alert, more careful with their words and actions. They didn't know Chief Lewis well yet, but they knew he was paying attention. Officer Dan kept to himself. He did his job, followed orders, and stayed out of trouble. But inside, he was thinking more deeply than he had in years. His talk with Chief Lewis had stuck with him. It wasn't just about the warning, it was about the truth behind the words. On Thursday morning, the chief called for a team meeting. Everyone gathered in the main room. There was no projector or long speech, just Chief Lewis standing at the front with a notebook in his hand. "I want to hear from you," he said. "What are we doing right? What needs to change? Speak honestly. This department won't grow if we stay silent." At first, no one said anything. People glanced around, unsure if it was a test. Finally, a young officer raised her hand. "Sometimes we don't take people's concerns seriously," she said, "especially in certain neighborhoods." The room grew quiet. Dan felt a chill run through him. The officer wasn't accusing anyone directly, but her words felt real. The chief nodded. "Thank you. Anyone else?" Another officer spoke about the way complaints were handled. Someone else mentioned the need for better training. Little by little, more voices joined in. No shouting, no blaming, just honest talk. Dan listened closely. He realized that others had seen the same problems he had ignored. He wasn't the only one who had been blind to them. When the chief asked if anyone had a suggestion, Dan surprised himself by raising his hand. "Maybe we should have more time in the field, getting to know people," he said. "Not just when there's a problem, just being present. Some officers looked at him, surprised. Dan had never been the one to speak up like that before. Chief Lewis gave a small nod. "That's a good idea," he said. "Thank you, Dan." He didn't say it with judgment or praise, just a calm voice that showed respect. Dan sat back, feeling something new, like maybe he was part of the solution now, not just the problem. After the meeting, a few officers stayed behind to talk. One of them walked up to Dan and gave a quick nod. "That was a good point you made." Dan nodded back. "Thanks." As the room emptied, Chief Lewis stood by the door, shaking hands and thanking people. When Dan walked past, the chief didn't say much, just looked him in the eye and said, "Keep it up." Dan walked out of the room, not as a man hiding from a mistake, but as someone trying to make it right. And that small change felt like a big step forward. Over the next week, Officer Dan made small changes to how he worked. He took more time to talk to people in the neighborhoods he patrolled. Not just about problems, but about their lives, their concerns, and what they needed. Some people were surprised. Others were cautious. But slowly, things started to shift. He noticed how just listening made a difference. One older man who owned a small shop on the corner told Dan, "You're the first officer to ask me how business is going." Dan didn't know what to say at first. He just nodded and listened. Later, he thought about how many people had felt ignored for years. Back at the station, Chief Lewis continued to meet with different teams. He didn't sit in his office all day. Instead, he walked around, asked questions, and listened. Officers began to see that he wasn't just a figure behind a desk. He was part of the work. One afternoon, Chief Lewis called Dan into his office again. This time, the mood felt lighter. "I heard you've been spending more time in the neighborhoods," the chief said. Dan nodded, trying to build trust. The chief looked pleased. "That's what we need. People can't trust what they don't know, and we can't help who we don't understand." He handed Dan a small folder. "We're starting a new program. I want you on it." Dan opened the folder and saw details about a community outreach team. It was a pilot program meant to improve relationships between officers and the people they served. The plan involved visiting schools, hosting public meetings, and walking the streets, not for patrol, but just to connect. "You think I'm the right one for this?" Dan asked, still a bit unsure. Chief Lewis smiled slightly. "You know where the problems are, and now you care enough to fix them." Dan didn't answer right away. He just nodded. It felt good to be trusted with something meaningful. Outside the office, other officers noticed the change in Dan. Some of them asked questions. A few even offered to help with the new outreach work. During one of their walks, Dan and two other officers stopped at a playground. A group of kids waved at them, laughing. One boy asked, "Are you guys the nice police or the scary ones?" Dan knelt down slightly, smiled, and said, "We're here to help, not scare." The boy smiled back and said, "Then you can stay." The moment stuck with Dan. It reminded him that respect had to be earned, not demanded, and it started with small things, like a kind word, a handshake, or simply showing up. Dan knew the work ahead wouldn't be easy. Not everyone would trust him right away, and not all officers would change overnight, but something real has started. And for the first time, Dan wasn't just wearing the badge. He was living what it stood for. Weeks passed, and the station slowly took on a new rhythm. Things didn't change overnight, but people began to notice the difference. Officers started talking more with each other, and with the community. Problems were still there, but now there were more people working to solve them the right way. Officer Dan had become part of the new outreach team. He led community walks, helped plan town meetings, and visited schools to answer questions from students. He never thought he'd be that kind of officer, but now it felt like the right path. One Friday afternoon, the department held a public event at the local park. Families gathered under tents, kids played near the fountain, and officers helped hand out food and water. There was music playing softly, and the smell of grilled food filled the air. Dan stood near the welcome table, talking to a few parents. He noticed Chief Lewis across the field, speaking with a group of local leaders. Even with so many people around, the chief still looked calm and focused, like he always did. A man approached Dan with a thoughtful expression. He looked familiar. After a moment, Dan remembered it was the same man he had yelled at weeks ago. The man he had wrongly judged and treated with disrespect. It was Chief Lewis, but back then, Dan hadn't known. "You've come a long way," the chief said with a quiet voice, stopping in front of him. Dan looked him in the eye. "I had to," he replied. "I didn't like the person I was becoming." Chief Lewis gave a short nod. "Growth comes from facing hard truths. You didn't run from it. That matters." Dan paused, then asked, "Do you really think things can change for good?" The chief looked around the park, the family smiling, the officers laughing with kids, the calm in the air. "Change is slow," he said, "but every honest step forward counts." They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the crowd. For Dan, it wasn't about praise. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about doing better every day. Later that evening, as the sun started to set, Dan helped fold chairs and clean up. A young boy walked up to him holding a small drawing. It showed a police officer with a big smile, standing next to a group of children. "This is you," the boy said proudly. Dan took the drawing and smiled. "Thanks, buddy." As the boy ran off, Dan looked at the picture. He folded it carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. For the first time in a long while, Dan felt proud, not just of the badge, but of the person behind it. He knew there would always be more work to do, more people to reach, more mistakes to fix. But now he walked with purpose. And this time he was walking in the right direction.